The Woods by the Little Brook. A short horror story. Written by Michael Vandervoort. Narrated by Robin Reads. We were in Nell's the day I told them about the thing in the woods. It was broad daylight, and, in the daylight, I felt safe. Plus, I wasn't alone. Not then. Though I was only 10, small and to my mind vulnerable, I was surrounded by 4 sensible, level-headed adults. Men. Men who, to me at least, seemed massive, solid and unbeatable, like giants made of steel. These weren't men who got scared. These were grown-up men. Men who went to grown-up jobs and did grown-up man things like fixing cars and drinking coffee. Men who wore overalls and cussed and didn't have time for things like fairy tales and stuff about the boogeyman. They were too busy doing men stuff, like fighting and swearing and drinking beer. They couldn't be scared. Or so I thought. Yet, when I told them, when I spat out the secret that had been churning in my stomach for days, none of them spoke, or fought, or cussed. None of them jumped to their feet, puffed out their chests, and stormed away to slay the creature. Instead, they just stared, each of them, silent and somehow small. There was something in the way they looked at me, in the naked truth of their silence, that scared me almost as much as the thing I'd seen. It made them, all of them, shrink before my eyes. They may not have believed in fairy tales, but there, in that diner, despite the sunshine and clatter of everyday life, they believed me. And for a few minutes, each of them was dragged back to a time when they too were scared of the dark. You see, it isn't unusual for children to say that they are scared of monsters. In some ways, it's a natural part of growing up. Learning to face fears and accept that stories are just stories, shadows just shadows, and the dark just the dark, takes reasoning. It takes experience. And, above all, it takes maturity, all learned over time. All things children don't have. Which is why, sometimes, it's not unusual for the more imaginative children to say that they've actually seen a monster. For them, the lines between reality and imagination are blurry, fact and fantasy easily merged, and reality oddly malleable. What is unusual, though, what really stands out as much as they try to deny it, what really puts the fear of God into parents and makes the hair on their neck stand on end, is when a child tells you they've seen a monster and you know when they say it, that they mean it. Now, I'm not talking about some throwaway line, some playful answers in a jokey conversation. I'm talking about those times when the child tells you honestly, with all the truthful, unvarnished conviction of youth, that they've seen it. When they tell you with tears in their eyes and a cracking of their voice, when they swear to you, Daddy, cross their hearts and hope to die, that it was real, that it was there, that there really was a monster, and they really did see it. That's when it is unusual. That's when the grown-ups listen. That day in Nell's, they listened. I think my dad had known for days that something was wrong. Usually it was a task to get me just to take a breath between words. Sentences, phrases, questions, and sounds spilled out of my mouth with such speed and unceasing fluidity that it was sometimes hard to tell where one topic ended and another started. It baffles me even to this day how my parents had the patience to put up with my constant inane chatter. Usually you couldn't shut me up. Usually. In the week before I told them, I'd hardly said a word. Mom and Dad assumed, at least at first, that I was worried for her. The previous week, a local girl had died giving birth to triplets, and though they tried to shield me from the news, these things have a way of getting around. They'd catch me sometimes, staring contemplatively at the gentle swelling of her bump, twitching my freckled nose in the way I always did when I was deep in thought, and sometimes still do. They tried to reassure me, to tell me that everything would be okay and that the doctors would look after Mum, and soon I'd have a new brother or sister, sisters plural as it turned out in the end. But my near silence continued. It was as if someone had found my remote and turned the volume down. It had nothing to do with the baby. I was worried for Mum, sure, but I trusted the doctors, and more than them, I trusted my dad. As far as I was concerned, his word was law, and if he said it would be okay, then it would. Most of the time. That day at Nell's, I'd still said hardly a word. Jimmy, a portly man in his mid-50s and my father's best friend, had looked at me quizzically and asked my pop if I was sick. Dad had just shrugged, and I hadn't answered. Instead, I had just sat there sucking distractedly on a strawberry milkshake that would usually have vanished in a single glass-straining effort. When you're scared, nothing registers. Everything tastes like nothing. Whilst Eddie's son, Billy, traced circles on the tabletop with a toy truck I would usually have been excited to see, but I instead fixed my gaze on the glass, only raising my head periodically to stare fixedly out of the window, out toward Fuller's Hill and the woods around it. I suppose, in my own way, I was already trying to say something, long before the words came. There were 6 of us there that day, crammed into one of the red leather diner booths with the cheap plastic menus. The 6 were my dad, Irv Jacobs, Jimmy Long, and Eddie White, as well as his son Billy and me. Since Eddie's wife and my mom had headed out for a girls' day, which I vaguely knew had something to do with hair rollers, the guys had decided to grab some lunch at Nell's and treat us boys to a milkshake each, whilst they discussed important matters like the game from the night before and Jimmy's efforts to convince Dolores Robin's daughter, Gail, to step out to the drive-thru with him. It was an average Saturday, save for my hush. Eventually, in the roundabout, meandering way that conversations do, the discussion turned to the news and, more specifically, to the stories we'd all heard about a flying saucer crashing in Roswell. Suddenly, my attention was snagged. I turned from the window and tuned in carefully to what was being said. I should explain that Little Brooke was a somewhat unremarkable town in New Mexico that just so happened to be a few short miles from the town of Roswell, where, in 1947, a flying saucer was purported to have crash-landed. We had all picked over the bones of the story about the crash. Families in their homes, guys sinking buds at dollies, and kids whispering in the playground had all gone through the same process of disbelief and mild worry at the initial story of space aliens crash-landing in the US, and smiled with balmy relief when it was explained away as a weather balloon. We had all laughed about what might have happened if the crash had been a spaceship, and what we'd all do if one of the ship's occupants walked into Nell's and ordered a double chocolate shake. "I mean it. Imagine it," Eddie said excitedly. "Little green men in Little Brook." He pointed to Billy and I and jokingly warned us, "Don't you go fooling around in those woods or the monsters will get you." Billy had looked up from his toy truck and smiled broadly, letting out a weary sigh that whistled through the gap where his 2 front baby teeth were missing, and Eddie smiled. When he turned to me, however, I wasn't laughing or sighing. Instead, I sat stock still, eyes fixed forward. I stared at him and watched his expression change from mischief to concern as my bottom lip began to tremble and my eyes filled with tears. "Jesus, Davy, what is it? Are you all right?" asked my dad, leaning over the table and grabbing my upper arm. "They're not green," I said, tears leaking down my cheeks now. "The aliens, they're not green. They're white, like milk or toothpaste." That's when the men at the table went silent. How do you know that, Davy?" asked Eddie softly. I stared at him in the eye. I wanted him to know that what I was saying was true, to see that I wasn't making it up. "Because I've seen them," I said. "In the woods by Fuller's Hill. I've seen the monsters, and—" I paused, trying to find another way to explain, but eventually all I could say was, "They were all white." Then I told them what had happened and what I'd seen. It happened the previous Tuesday. I was riding my bike home from Mike's, my best buddy at the time and still a close friend today, and I was late. It was 6:45, and I was already scared. Not because the sun was throwing its last orange blush onto the trees, or because somewhere behind the hill the darkness was waiting to creep out, but because the streetlight had already come on. Usually, when we were playing outside, that was the signal to go home, since they came on around 6:30, and I was due home by 7 p.m. sharp. Though I had my bike, I was worried I wouldn't make it, and at that point I feared my mother's sharp scolding or my father's stern scowl far more than I did the darkness. For those familiar with the landscape of New Mexico from documentaries about Roswell on the Discovery Channel, the idea that we had woods at all might be surprising, much of the area being, as it is, comprised of little more than barren rock, scrubgrass, and dust. What gave us the woods and made the town different was the same thing that gave the town its name: the Brooke. More accurately, the river and the lake that sat in a depression at the top of Fuller's Hill. Fed by underground springs, its waters clearly also permeated the rock in the surrounding area because, for several miles, the land was tightly packed with clusters of pine, elm, spruce, and even the occasional oak tree. What was more pressing to me, however, was not the stretch and extent of the woods, but the network of paths that cut through them. Little more than dirt tracks, these walkways carved shortcuts between Mill Brook, along which I was currently speeding, and Main Street, up which I would need to pedal before turning off toward home. To ride around the base of the hill and the edge of the woods I knew would take at least 15 minutes, even going at this speed. On the other hand, a short walk through the woods could get me there in half the time. I pulled up my bike and considered. I had been warned many times against going into the woods at night. The climate in that part of the world made deadfalls a very real possibility, even though they did not extend very far. The idea of a child getting lost in the woods or up by the pond was still a danger. Still, it would get me home on time. I looked again at the sky, at the greyish-purple colouring of the clouds and the semicircle of sun I could just see over the hill as it slunk away to rest. I tried to convince myself, somewhat unsuccessfully, that it wasn't really night yet. It was dusk, twilight, the end of the day. There was still enough light and enough time for me to wheel my bike through the woods and make it to the other side before night actually fell, and I would have been breaking the rules. It was close, I knew, but I was still on the right side of night time. Nevertheless, I looked around to make sure that no one was around, that there wasn't anyone taking an evening stroll who might be confused about the time of day and wrongly report back to my mother that I went into the woods at night. This isn't night, I told myself. This definitely isn't night. Though, as I took the first few steps off the tarmac and into woods, wheeling my bike with a steady rhythmic click of the spokes, I did wish that my bike had a lamp, and, as I stepped in, feeling the street-lit world recede and the trees close behind me, I knew that night was very close indeed. It was cooler in the wood, and, for a few moments, the difference in temperature felt bracing and refreshing, sharpening my senses and enabling me to up my pace, so that the first part of the path disappeared quickly. I'll be out soon, I told myself, watching the yellow dirt path twist before me. Soon I'd see the lights on Main Street, and it would only be a few hundred yards, and I'd be out. But I couldn't help noticing that the yellow colouring of the path was fading, and that it suddenly seemed very dark. The woods themselves were quiet, as if all the creatures that scurried and chirped in the daytime had hunkered down for the night, leaving the air between the trees empty and silent. I heard the soft clack of my bike wheels turning, the frame jogging up and down as the tires hit a stone or went over a root. There was no way I could have ridden through. The ground was too uneven, and even in the day it was a bad idea. "What do you mean in the day?" I scolded myself. "This is the day." But it wasn't. Night, cloaked in black, had crept stealthily around me. Now the spaces between the trees showed no details. Instead, they bled into a single, uniform wall of black. I started to hurry, my steps quickening. A few more minutes, I told myself, a few more minutes, and I'd be out. I listened to the awful, pregnant hush of the woods, not just quiet, but a conscious withholding of sound, as if the trees were deliberately muted to allow me to hear. Again, the clack, clack of the spokes, the rustle of leaves underfoot, and somewhere to my right, the snap of a branch. I turned and looked toward the sound, to the dark space between the trees. I felt my heartbeat hard in my chest, my hands gripping tightly at the handles of the bike as I stood and started, willing myself to continue walking, to turn my back on whatever had made that sound, whatever was waiting, watching from somewhere between the trees. I turned and pushed at the bike and started to move, quicker now, faster and faster, a walk that almost broke into a jog. Had I not had the bike, I knew I'd half run, freewheeling, flat out, without looking back, out of the woods, into the light and out of the dark. Another twig snapped behind me. My head spun to chase the sound, drawn to the movement. "There's nothing there," I told myself. "Stop being stupid. There's nothing there." But there was. "What did it look like, Davy?" my father asked earnestly. At first, I'd been scared to say that I'd gone into the woods, but that seemed long ago, a detail left behind like a milestone in a story that had much further to go. My dad didn't care about that, but he did care about this. "What did you see?" he asked. So, I told him. The thing in the woods was completely white. Not white in the way people say that Caucasians are white, but the color of paper, snow, or yogurt, a brilliant, bleached white that looked somehow empty or erased, like something that had once had color, but from which the pigment had been leached out over time. Today, I'd compare it to the difference between a photo shot in black and white and one from which the color has been removed. Somehow, the ghosts of the pigments remain in the latter, despite them being no longer there. The thing was hunched behind a tree. In form, it looked to me like a shaved monkey or a chimpanzee, all lithe, sinewed limbs and taut, tensile strength. Its eyes were blank, lacking pupils or iris, and the skin hung from the bones beneath as if it weren't attached to the muscles. Its chest seemed to protrude out in an arching barrel, like something you'd see on a rooster or chicken, the sternum and ribs pressed straining against the filmy, almost translucent skin. Its pink mouth, the only color on its blank, hairless body, yawned open, and a strangled sound like a dog's yelp escaped from its mouth. Its arm reached forward, and it may have taken a few steps, but by then I was gone. I ran, still pushing the bike, and after a few seconds, with agility I didn't know I had, I leapt onto the seat and pedaled, roots and stones be damned. I pedaled for my life over the jarring peaks and pits of that footpath, leaving a cloud of dust and sand in my wake. I don't think I breathed till I hit Main Street, and when I did, I fired out of the woods like a bullet fired from within. It's a miracle that no cars were coming down because I didn't stop to look, but instead simply shot out into the road, into the light, leaving whatever the hell that thing was called behind. When I reached the door to my house, I stood outside for a full 5 minutes, trying to stop myself from shaking. Eventually, my mom opened the door to find me simply standing there. "It's 7:05, young man. 1 more minute and you'd have been in big trouble." "Yes, ma'am," I said solemnly as I stumbled into the house, never so glad to be home. Later that evening, after Nell's, the other men didn't go home as usual. Instead, they came with my dad and I back to our house. Billy came too. Within half an hour, 5 other men had arrived at the house, and I was told to go upstairs and play, Whilst Billy enthusiastically examined the contents of my room and amused himself with my toys, I wasn't interested in playing. Instead, I sat on the top step of the stairs where I could just about see that the men were huddled around our kitchen table. The last time I had seen a meeting like this was when Mrs. Doherty's dog, Ronald, had got the rabies and the men had met to arrange tracking him down. That meeting had been solemn and businesslike, but there was a what had to be done feel to it. This meeting felt different. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back now, I can pinpoint the difference. This time, they were scared. "You sure the boy didn't imagine it?" asked one. Gus, from the local gas station, whose pot belly was only just being contained by the buttons of his lumberjack shirt. I saw Eddie give Gus a stern glance, but my father answered a fair question with a fair answer. "That boy's 10 years old and has been talking since he was 1. In all that time he ain't never told me a lie. If he says he saw it, then he saw it." Eddie backed this up with further assurances. "I don't know what the kids saw up there, but I'm telling you, the poor little guy was frightened half to death. Whatever it was, it shook him up good. Ever since that Roswell crash, things have been getting mighty spooky around here. Now, if there is something up in them woods that my boy walks through and plays in, then by God I want to know what it is." There was a long pause, during which nobody said a word. Then, in a single decisive moment, my father rose from the table and, without saying a word, he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. The other men followed directly behind. 2 of them were carrying guns. The morning after he had left with the men in tow, my father simply told me that there was nothing to worry about, that everything was taken care of and I didn't need to be scared. When I tried to press him as to exactly what had happened, he simply shook his head. "Just stay out of those woods at night, you hear me? There's a good boy." 40 years later, while sitting in a nursing home in Albuquerque, my father decided that enough time had passed and told me what had really happened that night. He explained how he and the other men had walked toward the woods only to find a group of men they didn't recognize standing by the tree line on Main Street, exactly where I had emerged the night I saw what I saw. The area had been cordoned off with tape. My dad said that some of the men emerging from the trees had masks on and white overalls, like people in the movies did when they were working with chemicals and whatnot. After a few minutes, a man wearing mirrored sunglasses, despite it being dark, came over to speak to them. He explained that there had been an incident with an animal escaped from a traveling circus, but that the whole matter had been dealt with and that they should return to their homes. When my dad asked what kind of animal, the man just shook his head and repeated that they should return to their homes. When I asked whether he believed the animal story, my dad shook his head. "Damn circuses and weather balloons. They take us for fools. Fools don't wear those chemical suits to pick up some escaped orangutans. I ain't never seen them carry off no damn circus animal in a body bag, neither." "Body bag?" I repeated. "Yup. They came out of the woods carrying it and threw it into one of those paddy wagons they had parked there. Must have been a heavy son of a gun, too, because it took 5 of them to carry it." My father died in 1999. After he died, the executor in charge of his will told me that, in addition to what I was expecting, I had also been bequeathed a small box, the contents of which the will stated were for my eyes only. I received the box by recorded delivery the following week. Inside was a copy of an autopsy report by a Dr. Michael Yates. I have changed the name of this individual in order to preserve his privacy, but readers should be assured that he is a medical doctor of great standing within the scientific community. In 1947, Dr. Yates was working for the American government at a medical facility, the location of which has never been confirmed. What has been confirmed by the man himself is that he did work there for almost 10 years, and that he did perform the autopsy I was now reading. The unsigned letter that went along with the report said that the enclosed writings had been released as part of a document request spearheaded by UFO enthusiasts keen to get their hands on information about the Roswell incident at the expiration of the 50-year seal on files classified at the time. How my dad came into possession of a copy I'll never know, but clearly my old dad had remained unconvinced by the circus nonsense and had kept tabs on the story. He knew it meant a lot to me and wanted me to know too. Whilst the report was overlooked by many looking for evidence of aliens or of otherworldly crafts and technology, my dad knew it would resonate with me. He was right. It did. In the year 2000, I attended a lecture delivered by the then 84-year-old Dr. Yates. Despite his age, the doctor spoke with great vitality and enthusiasm, and held the audience's attention for the entire duration of his hour-long lecture and for the question-and-answer session he gave afterwards. The fact that his greeting at the start of his speech was the only part I understood didn't put me off. I wanted to meet him and, if possible, ask about the report. As the doctor was clearing his things, I approached him, asked if I might take a few minutes of his time, and showed him my copy of the report. His first words were, "Where did you get this?" When I explained, he shook his head. "I'm sorry, that was a long time ago, and I don't think I can help you." As he said this, I watched as his eyes peered over my shoulders, darting around to see if anyone else was watching or listening to our conversation. He continued to pack his bags and seemed to consider the matter closed. I, however, was not to be deterred so easily. "With all due respect, Doctor, I've read this report. I don't think it's the kind of thing you would forget." Yates looked up from his bag into which he was piling his notes. "And how, pray tell, would you know what I do and don't remember, I fixed my eyes on his in the same way I had fixed them on Eddie's 50 years earlier. "Because what you saw dead in 1947, I saw alive, and I've never forgotten it, and I doubt you have either." Dr. Yates put down his bag and, once again looking over my shoulder, took in a long, deep breath. He took a step closer and sighed. What the hell? What are they going to do? Kill me? There's a coffee shop on the corner downstairs. 20 minutes. With that, he closed his bag and walked away without so much as a goodbye. I walked to the end of the street. Sure enough, there was a coffee shop, the sign above the door of which read, "Nell's Coffee House, a taste of home." I couldn't help but smile. 20 minutes later, I was sitting at a window table opposite Dr. Yates. He ordered a mocha and, after making sure that the waitress was well out of earshot, placed his hands on the table and in a low voice asked, "What do you want to know?" After explaining my story and why I was interested in his autopsy, Dr. Yates explained that what he had done in that lab 50 years earlier was a routine autopsy. It was the cadaver that was anything but routine. Some details I had already been able to ascertain from the report, which meant that I was at least in some part prepared for the details Yates would give me. What I was not prepared for, however, was the conclusions he drew from those details, conclusions about which he was entirely convinced. The first point he wished to stress was that he had never, in all of his time working for the government, seen, operated on, or met anyone who had operated on an extraterrestrial life form. According to him, he had never seen, touched, or encountered an alien. Ever. When I asked him if he believed that there were aliens involved in the Roswell crash, he smiled. "Does the Pope shit in the woods?" was his response. According to Yates, the body described in the autopsy report, the body of the thing I had seen in the woods, was that of a human, a man aged around 40. When I began to protest, to stress the idea that no human being I had ever seen looked like that, he simply raised his hand to silence me. It worked, and I listened. "I did not say," he went on, "that this was in any way a normal human being. For one thing," he explained, "the chest cavity was immense, the rib cage expanded to almost 3 times the normal size. This description fit perfectly with my chicken chest analogy and the way that I remembered the creature. Yates explained that this deformity must have been there from birth, because the musculature in the back and torso was also unusually large, suggesting that it had grown that way to accommodate such a deformity. He went on to say that the reason for the expanded chest cavity was revealed during internal examinations. The man's lungs and heart were also more than twice the normal size. He confirmed that the skin had a bleached white appearance and that the eyes were without pupils or iris. The bones and muscle tissue, he added, were unusually dense, explaining that the man would have been incomparably strong. "Compared to the others, though," he muttered between sips of his coffee, "this one was quite small." I stared at the doctor in disbelief. "Others?" I asked. "Others," he repeated. Yates explained that in 1947 he had examined 6 similar specimens, the first 5 in the first 2 weeks after the Roswell crash, the 6th, the one I had seen, almost a month later. "I'd guess that this one was the one that got away. He probably found little Brooke because he was looking for water and then stayed, hiding out there. By the time he got to me, he was already dead." As he continued speaking, Dr. Yates's voice had risen from a whisper to a normal speaking voice. He had relaxed back in his chair and seemed by the second to be becoming more and more open about sharing this information. After pausing momentarily to order another coffee and a slice of pie, he sighed deeply and smiled. "You need to be careful getting into this stuff, Sonny," he said wearily. "There's a lot of people who don't want you knowing about this stuff." I remained silent for a moment, but eventually decided to ask, "Aren't you scared?" Yates's smile broadened into a wide, toothy grin, and eventually a crackling, phlegmatic laugh. "I'm 84. I have no wife and no kids to worry about." He took a huge slice of pie and piled it into his mouth, speaking with mouth open as he chewed. "What I do have is liver cancer. I got about a year, tops. What are they going to do? Kill me?" I watched as Yates took another huge slice of pie, slicing through the crust and scooping the piece up onto the fork in one fluid motion. "Thing is, the fact that these things exist isn't the scary part. The scary part is why." Before he'd finished his pie, Yates told me his theory as to what the thing in the woods actually was. And he was right. It was scary. Yates explained that in some ways the specimens he had worked on were advanced. Whilst there was no way to ascertain their mental capacity, they were physically far more capable than the average human. The other specimens on which he worked, 2 females and 3 other males, were much larger than the man in the autopsy report. Oddly, he began explaining his theory by asking how much I knew about American history. "You know, there are these crackpots that talk about alien abduction. They talk about how they were taken up in a beam of light and had experiments done on them," he said, cleaning the lens of his glasses on his tie. "Well, they always operate on the assumption that these aliens, or whatever, are endlessly curious about us, and that all they want to do is probe Sheila from Minnesota and then return her home afterward." I nodded to indicate that I was following, but was honestly wondering at this point where Yates was going with it. "Did you know," he said, swallowing yet another slice of pie, "that in the 400 years it operated, over 12 million men, women, and children were abducted from their homes in Africa and sold like cattle in the transatlantic slave trade?" I again nodded, more to indicate that I knew of the slave trade than that I knew the figures. "What do you think happens to the people who really get abducted by aliens? The ones that never come back?" I felt my mouth go dry. "Every year, 600,000 people are reported missing in the United States. By the end of the year, most have been accounted for or explained away, but around 3,000 are never found. Ever. That means no body turned up, no remains, no trace.
What if they've been taken away for the same reason that some humans kidnapped others a few centuries ago?
His voice had taken a sharp, resentful edge, an undercurrent of bitter conviction flavoring his words.
It is one of the truly disgusting stains on this country's history that, when the slave owners got to the Americas and had their slaves, they treated them like animals, like they were beasts of burden, and as if they were a lesser species. It makes me sick to my stomach to think of it. It was a common practice to selectively breed the strongest slaves to try and produce better, more powerful stock in each successive generation.
He paused, his level of disdain for these events evident in the curl of his lip as he spat the words.
When you look at that thing you saw in the woods, you see a monster. When I look at it, I see selective breeding, a thing built for labor. The bigger lungs, stronger bones and muscles, don't you see? All of it is to help them work. The skin and the eyes, that's the result of genetic mutations and adaptation to other environments far away from here, further from their sun.
I listened to this rant, not knowing how to respond. Was what Yates was saying possible? That there were creatures, aliens, who abducted human beings to use as slaves, regarding them as little more than cattle? Yates dabbed at his mouth with a napkin and went on.
I don't know what crashed at Roswell. I don't know if there were aliens aboard. But I do know this. The thing you saw in the woods, the human being that I conducted an autopsy on, was the only one of the 6 not found wearing shackles. I think that ship brought something here that wasn't from this world. I think whoever brought it here brought their slaves as well. I took a large gulp from the water in my glass. His theory made an awful sort of sense. I could have believed it, but I didn't want to. Surely, I said, gathering my thoughts, if this were happening, if these things really were abducting people to use as slaves or to add them to their slave gene pool, we'd know. The government would know. Hell, you worked for them. You can't be the only one that drew these conclusions. Yates gave something that almost looked like a smile, but wasn't. It was a sad, tired expression, full of disappointment and weighed down by years of bottled anger. He nodded his head slowly. Of course they know, he said.
He raised one bony finger and pointed toward me as if admonishing me for being so naive.
But you're assuming they'd want to stop it. Slavery, my boy, was always a deal. People were exchanged as commodities to be bought, sold, and exchanged. They didn't call it a trade for nothing. Think about it. These beings have all the secrets of the universe to offer in trade, in exchange for all that. What do you think our government has in abundance, technically a surplus, that it might be willing to sell?
According to the figures from January 2023, there are over 15,000 people missing in the United States. Of those, many will never be found. Dr. Michael Yates died a month after our conversation, believing he knew what happened to some of them. I hope that he was wrong. Please, God, let him be wrong. This has been The Woods by the Little Brook, a short horror story. Written by Michael Vandervoort. Narrated by Robin Reads. Copyright 2024 by Michael Vandervoort. Production copyright by Michael Vandervoort.